Democratic lawmakers, of course, had a lot to say following the Derek Chauvin verdict, which was, of course, guilty on all 3 counts. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi's reaction, though, in particular, has really captured the ire of many. Let's take a listen.
Thank you, George Floyd, for sacrificing your life for justice, for being there to call out to your mom. How heartbreaking was that? Call out for your mom. I can't breathe. But because of you, and because of thousands, millions of people around the world who came out for justice, your name will always be synonymous with justice.
Contributing editor at Current Affairs, former national press secretary for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, and host of the Bad Faith podcast, Briahna Joy Gray joins us now to talk about it. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Nancy Pelosi, it's a good example. My question is, why are some of these politicians so incapable of reacting to tragedy and to news like basic human beings?
Well, I think it frankly is revealing. It reveals the extent to which a lot of these public figures are truly detached from the reality of lived lives, not just of communities that are a different racial background or class background, but the whole gamut of being in touch with regular people who understand what the conversation around George Floyd and policing more broadly has been like. If you are someone like Nancy Pelosi, you can only access this type of politics through the most kind of symbolic and superficial way. You're going to see George Floyd as a totem that shows that you're on the right side of some kind of political football field. You're the Democrat. You're the good guy. I like George Floyd. I have empathy for him as a man who had a mother, as opposed to seeing him within a broader political context, the Democratic Party to date still wants to do very little to change. I'm reminded of the fact that just a few months back, we got a leaked tape of a Biden call with a number of civil rights leaders, from Al Sharpton to Sherrilyn Ifill, during which Sherrilyn Ifill of the Legal Defense Fund asked Joe Biden to make a number of executive orders from the George Floyd Policing Act, which would go some way to creating actual justice in this country so that people didn't have to die in order for there to be any gains made here. And Joe Biden's response was that he didn't want to use executive orders. He was reluctant to use executive authority. And then he pivoted to talking about how much the defund movement was going to hurt his political campaign. That's
right.
Where we are right now. So I'm not surprised by Nancy Pelosi's response.
This is such a good point because, look, the defense of Nancy Pelosi, she's old, she's awkward, she meant well, so don't worry that much about the words. But let's talk about the actions, because I think that's what you're bringing up that's really important. There are a couple of pieces there that I'd love you to get into more. First of all, the excuse for Democratic failures in the fall was the defund the police slogan. Now, look, I think that slogan was misinterpreted by a lot of people, and it is not a popular slogan. But Democrats had their own failures for why they underperformed dramatically in the House. Chief among them, I would say Nancy Pelosi playing a lot of games with the stimulus check on the end. That was very transparent to people. There's a reason why Joe Biden did better than Democrats either in the Senate or in the House. So number one, you see how that demonization comes back now and has real world policy consequences, because Biden said, look, I can't do anything on this criminal justice reform stuff, even though I campaigned on it, because it's going to be politically toxic and I'm worried about winning Georgia. So he doesn't do the executive orders. Very quietly, as this trial was going on, he disbanded his police oversight commission, which was, again, something that he promised on the campaign trail. And then, Briahna, to add to all of this, senior Democratic and Republican aides leaked to Axios that the guilty verdict in this trial probably takes the pressure off of them from actually having to do anything on police reform. The end result of all of this is that you had the largest protest movement in history. That has led to tangible action at the local and some at the state level. The federal level, literally nothing has changed.
That's right. And, first I want to say that the defund slogan has had a range of responses over the course of the past year. And the popularity was actually high and rising in the months at the beginning of the protest movement, when the calls being made were very clear, when there was media support behind the uprising, when the moral stakes seemed really obvious. And as a number of figures, including Joe Biden himself, began to antagonize the slogan and be dismissive of the movement, obviously there was a course correction, right? The same way when Joe Biden started talking about how he wasn't going to ban fracking, I believe there was a 20% decline in Democratic support for banning fracking. The idea that these kind of slogans, or not slogans, movement asks, policy demands are fixed in time as opposed to shifting as a direct result of authority figures making claims one way or another, I think is a little misstated sometimes. But I will also point out that a lot of things are unpopular, like tax cuts for the rich, the SALT deductions that the Democrats are going to the mat over. And there's never any conversation about how those are going to affect people down the line electorally. Because at the end of the day, the Democratic Party has revealed itself that it is substantively interested in dealing with the issue of racial inequality and police violence in this country. Only insofar as you put on a kente cloth mask and kneel for a photo shoot.
So I want to circle back to something you just mentioned, which is that it seems as though perceived public opinion is the big roadblock for the Democratic establishment nationally at taking some of these steps. And I wonder, is it also this sort of coalition? If you look at somebody like Bernie Sanders, who's also very popular with the white working class, is there a weird interplay between sort of when it comes to issues of racial justice and movements like defund the police, where, public opinion with coalitions that Democrats historically have relied on and still do to some extent, is defund the police unpopular with the working class? Is it unpopular nationwide, or is it more popular to kind of what you were saying earlier than people realize?
I think that's an interesting question, because sometimes this issue is framed as though there are trade-offs, that to appeal to a mass multiracial working class coalition, you have to ignore the issues that are important to discrete communities. But we all understand that not everyone prioritizes health insurance. Not everyone works a minimum wage salary. In fact, the vast majority of Americans earn more than a minimum wage salary. Most Americans aren't homeless, and on down the list. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we believe that we should pull our punches and not fight for those issues and talk about those issues. I mean, you will have elites in both parties waxing philosophical over things like, mortgage interest deductions when so many Americans don't have a house. So I really reject the idea that, one, this is an issue that doesn't resonate across racial groups. You had Toledo, a child murdered who is Hispanic. You had the really gruesome shooting of the young white man on the hallway by the police point blank a few years ago. And as people like Zed Jelani often point out, class is a significant driving force for a lot of these encounters. Very few affluent people of any race are gunned down, murdered by the police in the kinds of ways that we have become familiar with as cell phone recordings have become more popular. So Bernie Sanders, to your example, never shied away from talking about and advocating for reforms that would dramatically address these kinds of issues. But what he did was do it in tandem with a whole host of other issues that were covering the bases of a multitude of communities. And I think that's really what politicians need to focus on, making sure that every community that might be in an audience that's listening to them feels heard.
Yeah, and the other person who actually does a really good job with this, who was an early Bernie Sanders supporter, is now Attorney General Keith Ellison of Minnesota. Briahna, so great to have you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Coming up, Will Jawando is going to talk to us about the changes he would like to see in policing. That's when Rising returns.